Atlanta's 23 worst public housing projects of all time are presented in this video. The gangs that dominated each complex are also discussed. We'll focus on old Atlanta before the 1996 Olympics, back when there were actual public housing projects in the city, not mixed-income communities. In the 1970s, Atlanta was labeled the murder capital of the United States, and the crack epidemic of the 80s caused the homicide rate to increase rapidly. By 1989, 1 of every 5 violent crimes in the city happened at a public housing project. Atlanta gangs emerged in the 80s as drug-driven organizations that operated from, and mostly within the city's housing projects, terrorizing residents to protect their territory, maintaining open-air drug markets, where dealers sold crack around the clock. Public housing projects in the A were originally built to open the doors to affordable housing, but they quickly became warehouses for poor people. The complexes were prisons of poverty where most households consisted of single mothers and their children. Families slept on the floor, and even in bathtubs to protect themselves from crossfire of gunfights just outside their windows. Hopelessness led residents to the pits of gangs, drug dealing, and violence. Without further ado, here are Atlanta's 23 worst public housing projects of all time. We'll start in Zone 1. Number 1. Bankhead Courts. Bankhead Courts was completed in 1970 and originally contained 500 units. The project was located on Bankhead Highway in Zone 1 and was built on a former landfill. In 1974, Atlanta's first black mayor, Maynard Jackson, spent a weekend at Bankhead as the guest of a widow and her 7 children, as a way of drawing attention to the horrible living conditions. A Times article explains that Bankhead is a $10 million public housing project where 2,646 low-income black people live. Though the project was completed only 4 years ago, it started falling apart almost immediately. Jackson wandered around the complex for most of the 2 days. He found rats feeding on garbage, noticed a number of light fixtures and heating vents that did not work, and came across 16 apartments that were uninhabited because they become flooded whenever it rains. He listened to residents complain about gangs. "We wonder why people get mad living there," he said later, promising federal funds and more city services to improve Bankhead. By the late 1980s, out of the 1,700 residents of Bankhead Courts, 1,025 were under 19 years old. 98% of the households were headed by women, and the average age of grandmothers there was 32. Only 42 of the residents held jobs. A 1988 article explains that on Monday afternoon, Ida Robinson was complaining that recent publicity about crime at the Bankhead Courts had been blown way out of proportion. "There are nice people out here," she said. On Tuesday evening, her son was shot in the leg as he walked through the complex, but that didn't change Mrs. Robinson's opinion. "Those things happen," she said. At the same time, she is worried each time she steps outside. "You can't even sit out here on the porch with all those boys on the corner selling drugs and carrying guns," Robinson explained. "It is a constant mental tug of war." She resents her community being labeled a war zone, but she lives as if it is one. A week after the U.S. Postal Service and Southern Bell said the Northwest Atlanta neighborhood was too dangerous for their letter carriers and telephone repairmen, the quality of life at Bankhead Courts has become a hot issue. The 3-day suspension of mail delivery and restriction of phone service has prompted Mrs. Robinson and other Bankhead residents to examine the drug-related violence they had come to accept as the norm. The almost daily shootings have virtually cut them off from the rest of the city and saddled them with a reputation so bad that taxi drivers, recreation leaders, and parents from other communities are scared to enter the neighborhood at all. A 1988 article explains that the Red Dog Squad has raided several public housing projects more than a dozen times. The Bankhead Courts complex in northwest Atlanta has been hit at least twice a month, yet residents say crack peddling and the accompanying violence have hardly slowed. The Red Dogs was the Atlanta Police Department's anti-drug squad. Its mission was to provide an aggressive police presence in areas of the city that have a high incidence of street drug sales, drug use, and drug-related violent crimes. The unit was disbanded in 2012 after the city agreed to pay more than $1 million to settle a federal lawsuit alleging that its officers used excessive force in a 2009 raid at a gay bar. The Atlanta Eagle. In a 1991 article, Bankhead Courts tenant Brenda Robinson shares her Bankhead Court code of survival, which she lives by. Rule number 1. Remember that there is a world outside Bankhead? Sitting on a living room couch, Miss Robinson says she knows mothers who seldom venture outside Bankhead, but she gets out, taking her 4 youngest on trips to museums and the library at least once a week. Rule number 2. Master fear. Her eldest daughter, Marvette, tells a story about a shootout one night between the Miami Boys gang and Bankhead residents. The shootout would determine who would sell drugs at Bankhead. Bankhead beat, Marvette says. nodding as she rocked on her dining room chair. While most people would be terrified after witnessing a gang shooting, Robinson and her family don't allow fear to ruin their lives. Rule number 3. Honesty is not the best policy. Robinson is thinking about starting her own jewelry-making business. She receives about $1,000 a month in support from the federal government, but that's not enough for 8 kids. She pays $47 a month in rent. The catch is, if she tells the Atlanta Housing Authority that she has a business, they will force her to pay more rent. If she pays more rent, she won't be able to save enough money to move her family out of Bankhead. Rule number 4. Hold on to your dream. Miss Robinson has her house picked out. I have a dream of a big round house with gardens inside, she says, and it's surrounded by land. Until that day comes, Miss Robinson lives by the Bankhead Code of Survival, takes her children on trips every Friday, protects them from neighborhood trouble, and tiptoes down to her living room at night to dance alone. Gangs and drug dealers dominated Bankhead during the crack epidemic of the 80s and early 90s. As Robinson's daughter explains, the Miami boys tried to take over the drug trade at the complex, but local dealers stood their ground and protected their territory. Despite the project's horrible conditions, one resident in particular was able to overcome. Montero Lamar Hill, better known as Lil Nas X, lived in Bankhead Court with his mother and grandmother before creating one of the biggest songs of 2019, and well, in history, the country trap hit Old Town Road. Bankhead Courts was demolished in 2011 after suffering years of neglect and structural damage from flooding. In 2024, Atlanta Housing announced that it was seeking public input for the redevelopment of the former Bankhead Court site.
Number 2. Bowen Homes. Bowen Homes was completed in 1964 and contained 650 units. The project was located at Yates Drive and Wilkes Circle in Zone 1. It provided housing for approximately 4,000 people displaced primarily from the old Buttermilk Bottoms area and other areas surrounding the Atlanta Civic Center. Unlike other projects in the A, Bowen also had public buildings on the complex, including a school and library, but that didn't protect the community from violence, and many considered it one of the most dangerous places in Atlanta. Boxer Evander Holyfield was raised in the Bowen Homes by a single mother and 8 older siblings. I grew up poor. My father did not have an education, and my mother only had a 4th grade education, but they worked hard, Holyfield wrote in May 2020 on Twitter. Rapper Shawty Lo grew up in the project and earned the nickname Bowen Homes Carlos, which was also the title of his 2010 Gangsta Grillz mixtape. Born Carlos Walker, he initially rose to fame as a founding member of the group D4L, also known as Down for Life. The crew ran with MDC, aka The Most Dangerous Clique, and the Shop Boys, best known for their 2007 hit, Party Like a Rockstar. D4L was well respected in Bowen Homes before becoming a rap group. Bowen was located on Donald Lee Hollowell Parkway, which was called Bankhead Highway, before being renamed in the late 90s. Rapper T.I. put Bankhead on the map years before Shawty Lo's rise to fame, and beef between the two MCs led Tip to film his video for What's Up, What's Happenin' at the Bowen Homes project. Sadly, Shawty Lo passed away in 2016. Gangs terrorized the Bowen Homes. In the early 1990s, a member of the I Refuse posse kidnapped Daryl Bernard, P.D. Daniel Jr., a 4-year-old resident of Bowen Homes, caught up in an alleged drug turf war. In 2010, Brandon Lewis, a member of the Young Dangerous Clique gang, was convicted of killing 18-year-old Deontay Hudson in the Bowen Homes housing complex. Lewis saw Hudson at a store near the project on November 13, 2007, and called and told other gang members to be on the lookout for Hudson so they could rob him. Lewis approached Hudson and began punching him. Hudson ran away, but Lewis shot him. Sadly, Hudson died on his way to the hospital. The 2009 demolition of Bowen made Atlanta the first major U.S. city to get rid of all its large-scale public housing projects. In an interview, Shawty Lo says, "I guess because there's been so many murders and assaults, and so much stuff went on in the apartments, they decided they should tear it down. It's like a town of its own. It's a baby Atlanta of its own." In 2023, Atlanta was awarded a $40 million federal grant to renew the Bowen Homes neighborhood.
Number 3. Eagan Homes. The John J. Eagan Homes was completed in 1940 and contained 648 units. The project was located on Play Lane in Zone 1 and cost $2 million to construct. The complex was originally built for African American tenants only. When it was first announced that the Atlanta Housing Authority planned a huge low-cost housing development for blacks on a site extending southward from Hunter Street to Westview, objections were raised by white residents in the West End section. This caused the authority to abandon that site, and the project was split up to make the Herndon and Eagan developments. Former Morehouse basketball coach, Grady Brewer, grew up in the complex. A 2020 article explains, he has a memory of being struck with fear as a young boy when he was subjected to racism upon encountering a rally on his way home from a Braves game. To the Eagan Homes housing project. Sadly, Brewer passed away in 2021, following an illness, at the age of 63. At Eagan, not even the rental office was safe from crime. A 1964 article explains that a bandit robbed the Eagan Homes project rental office of $1,593 in cash and checks, police said. Janita Smith, an employee, said the man entered, and had his hand in his pocket as if he held a gun, and gave her a note which read, "Don't say a word. This is a stick-up. Put the money in a bag." She said he took it and walked out. In 1988, 6-month-old Latisse Hambrick was beaten to death in February in an Eagan Homes public housing project apartment in northwest Atlanta, known as a crack house. Her mother and uncle were arrested and charged with cruelty to children, but police said so many people were in and out of the apartment that almost anybody could have been the killer. The child had been dead for some time before the body was found. The Miami boys controlled the drug trade at the Eagan Homes. Their connections in Florida enabled them to provide a higher quality of cocaine at lower prices than their landlocked competitors. In the late 80s, the Miami boys split into factions. The Eagan faction sold cocaine on the 400 block of Lindsay Street and 1000 block of Palmetto Avenue. Eagan Homes was demolished in the 2000s and replaced by Magnolia Park, a mixed-income community.
Number 4. Harris Homes. The Joel Chandler Harris Homes were completed in 1957 and contained 510 apartments, earning it the nickname, the 510-unit project. It was located on Sells Avenue in Zone 1. Harris Homes was the last project built in Atlanta that was intended for whites only. A few years after it was completed, housing projects were integrated, thanks to the passage of the Federal Civil Rights Act in 1964. By 1969, blacks were the majority at the previously all-white Harris Homes. A 1989 article explains that 15-year-old Jamie Matthews was different things to different people. To some residents of the Harris Homes project, he was an arrogant punk trying to make a fast buck selling fake cocaine. The 5'1" freshman was at a well-known open-air drug market in the project Tuesday night when 2 cars pulled up to him, and several men inside fired 7 or 8 shots out the windows. He was hit once in the right chest and died shortly after, arriving at Grady Memorial Hospital. In 1991, the bodies of a man and a woman were found in an apartment in the Harris Homes, and carbon monoxide poisoning was being explored as a possible cause of death, police said. A faulty heater was suspected in the 2 deaths. When we got here, the door was not locked, the heater was on full force, and all the windows were down and locked, police said. It must have been 100 degrees in here. In 1992, an 11-year-old was shot and a 13-year-old companion was charged with aggravated assault after a dispute between playmates turned violent, police said. The 11-year-old and 2 13-year-olds were outside an apartment at 400 Peoples Street in the Harris Homes housing complex when the youngest boy and one of the others began fighting. During the struggle, one of them got shot, police said. In 1997, 22-year-old Umar Smith shot and killed 16-year-old Kenyon Maddox in the parking lot of the Harris Homes, just a few days after he refused to share a hollowed-out cigar stuffed with marijuana, police said. In 1999, HUD awarded the Atlanta Housing Authority a $30 million HOPE 6 grant check to transform Harris Homes. Perhaps no one is happier than Harris Homes residents themselves, another important partner group in the project. They've grown tired of battling the problems of crime, inadequate maintenance, and other quality of living issues associated with public housing, and of residing in an aging complex that had been left out of the AHA's modernization loop. Harris Homes was demolished in 2000 and redeveloped as College Town at West End, a mixed-income community.
Number 5. Herndon Homes. The Alonzo F. Herndon Homes project was completed in 1941 and contained 520 units. The complex was located at Sells Avenue and John Street in Zone 1. It was originally built for African American tenants and cost $1,798,000 to construct. The Herndon Homes Boys was a gang that arose from the project. In the 1990s, at least 7 shootings, including 3 murders, were attributed to a war between the Herndon Homes Boys and the Miami Boys over a woman. 3 men, said to be Miami Boys, were convicted for the 1990 basketball court slaying of Tony Minter. Police said Minter was a Herndon Homes boy who was marked for a hit because he allegedly robbed members of the Miami Boys. According to law enforcement, the Herndon Homes boys were concentrated at Kennedy and Strong Streets near the project, and they sold heroin and cocaine. Members were also suspected of robbing rival drug dealers. Theophilus, Big Wheel Roker, Charlie, Shorty Red Hudson, and Terrence, Fat Boy Elway, were sentenced to life for killing Minter. The three also received an additional 40 years for wounding two other players in the hail of automatic gunfire during a pickup basketball game at John F. Kennedy Elementary School. Roker also is believed to have ordered an unsuccessful 1990 hit on Todd Eric Hollis, a Herndon Homes boy who once dated Roker's girlfriend and is now in prison on a drug conviction. The Herndon Homes boys are believed to have killed Roker's cousin, Terrence Prep Brown, who was riddled with 9mm automatic gunfire, in apparent retaliation for Minter's death. Informants told police the Miami boys showed up at the scene of the slaying. Roker gives the order, "I want some blood," and the Miami boys began plotting their revenge on the spot, taking the keys to Mr. Brown's girlfriend's Herndon Homes apartment from the dead man's pocket. They allegedly held her captive for 2 days, while they eavesdropped on the community through the open windows of her apartment to find out who killed Mr. Brown. Then the Miami boys get in an argument about who's going to shoot him. They all race for the door to shoot, and one of them sticks the gun out the window and shoots him. The rest then light him up. Then they run through the project, shooting people at random, a 15-year-old girl in the foot and another man. Police went to great lengths, 663 miles, to arrest Roker. Officers, who already had an arrest warrant for Roker, received a tip that he would be attending his cousin's funeral in Miami. He was pulled from the funeral procession and arrested by Miami police. Informants told police that Roker was driving a rented van in the procession in hopes of recruiting more members for his gang. He had planned to bring them back to Atlanta to wipe out the Herndon Homes boys gang. Despite being a war zone, Herndon Homes was a filming location for the 2010 movie Lottery Ticket, which featured Bow Wow, Notori Naughton, Charlie Murphy, Terry Crews, Mike Epps, Loretta Devine, and Ice Cube. Herndon Homes was demolished in 2010, and in 2021, it was replaced with Herndon Square, a mixed-income community.
Number 6. Hollywood Courts. Hollywood Courts was completed in 1969 and contained 202 units. It was located on Hollywood Court in Zone 1. Terry Pugh, a 15-year-old victim of Wayne Williams's Atlanta child murders, was determined to make a life for himself away from the poverty and hopeless overcrowding in the 3-bedroom apartment in the Hollywood Court Public Housing Project, where he and most of his 10 brothers and sisters lived. Pugh spent his last night alive, January 21, 1981, joking with waitresses in an all-night hamburger restaurant on Memorial Drive in southeast Atlanta. His body was found the next day on a roadside in Rockdale County. He appeared to have been strangled from behind with a rope-like object, and scratches on his face indicated he was one of the few victims who put up a struggle. Investigators found on Pugh's body fibers and dog hairs that were similar to the fibers and dog hairs found on other victims' bodies. During the trial, a fiber expert for the FBI testified that the fibers and dog hairs found on 9 murdered black youths can be traced to the home or automobile of Wayne B. Williams. Some of the gangs that were active at the Hollywood Courts include the Hollywood Courts Boys and Most Dangerous Bloods, aka MDB. The leader of the Hollywood Courts gang was Derek Colbert, better known as Monkey Man. He was murdered by Billy Diablo, who was one of the heads of the Diablos gang from the Perry Boulevard area of Atlanta. Rapper Andre 3000 mentions Hollywood Courts on the track Spodie, OD, Dopalicious, which was on Outkast's 3rd album Aquemini. Drake and J. Cole have both reinterpreted the line, "Who else? Really trying to mess with Hollywood Cole?" Although the project was demolished in 2012, former residents reunite each year around Mother's Day to celebrate Hollywood Courts Day.
Number 7. John Hope Homes. The John Hope Homes were completed in 1941 and contained 606 units. The project was located on Sells and John Street near the University Homes in Zone 1. The Hope Homes were originally for black tenants only and cost about $3 million to construct. Like many of the projects in Zone 1, the Miami boys controlled drug distribution at the Hope Homes. The gang was broken up into sets, and the John Hope set operated on the 1000 block of Palmetto Avenue and dealt cocaine on Greens Ferry Avenue and Delmar Lane. The Miami boys beefed with a gang known as the John Hope Robbing Crew, leading to multiple murders. A 1989 article explains that Michael, Too Short, Penix, and 4 acquaintances were ripping off drug dealers in the crack-ridden McDaniel-Glenn housing project. When one dealer apparently pumped a high-caliber pistol shot into the youth's side, Atlanta police say Michael may have been part of a small band of thieves, the John Hope Robbing Crew. that operated in several Atlanta public housing projects. Two other alleged members, Renard Smith and Clinton Porter, both 16, were shot to death this month at the John Hope Homes housing project. A gang known as the Terry White Boys was also active in the complex. White was a drug kingpin in Atlanta who went to war with the Miami Boys over control of the Hope Homes. A 1988 article explains, last week's case involved the shooting death of Emma Lois Johnson, who was hit by a stray bullet between the Miami Boys and a local gang called the Terry White Boys over control of dope sales at two public housing projects. Testimony in the trial indicated that Wanderil DeMarcus McGee was a member of the Terry White Boys, and Roberto Casmus Nelson of Miami was a member of the Miami Boys. McGee testified that he had worked for a man named Terry White for about a year, selling cocaine. He said he joined other gang members in a confrontation with the Miami Boys in defense of a territory that consisted of two public housing complexes, John Hope and University. They came to the projects and said they would take over, said McGee, who testified that the Miami Boys were told, "This turf is already taken." The gun battle lasted for 4 or 5 minutes. Everybody started firing. I fired one shot and noticed that my gun was jammed and started running. I didn't want to be in a gunfight without a gun that was working. Nelson's attorney, Bob Joyner, told the jury that there's a mess in Atlanta when a drug gang leader, White, is so powerful he can put a truckload of 4 men, armed with Soviet-designed AK-47 assault rifles on the streets. The Hope Homes were demolished in the 2000s and replaced with the villages at Castleberry Hills, a mixed-income community.
Number 8. Perry Homes. Perry Homes, also known as the Sweat Road Project, was completed in 1954 and contained 1,100 units. The project was located 6 miles from downtown Atlanta, in the city's industrial northwest section of Zone 1. The complex was originally built for African American tenants. A 1988 article explains, often, while watching the 2 roadways entering his low-income housing project, Irvin Boogie Tanner sees a security crew of former star athletes and schoolmates armed with walkie-talkies, carefully monitoring incoming traffic. But unlike neighborhood watch teams in other parts of the city, Tanner said these young men are protecting cocaine-ridden apartments and small criminal businesses in Perry Homes from police. Their sophisticated technique makes the housing project, a few miles west of downtown Atlanta, a citadel hidden from investigation and virtually impenetrable to local police. "They can make $5,000 a day in here," said Tanner, a 13-year resident, pointing to an apartment near his, where the deals often take place. "Drugs is such fast money. They can make $500 an hour out there on the street," he said. Rather than crack, the smokable, high-grade, processed cocaine sold in tiny vials, the cane popular in Perry Homes, is most often mixed with water and injected by needle, or combined with marijuana in an additive mix, called geek junk, and rolled into cigarettes that sell for $5, he said. And instead of a free market underworld enterprise, the drug salesmen in the projects are salaried employees, part of a complex venture that entices the best, tarnishes the brightest, and has ruined the lives of many of Tanner's peers. "There's so many drugs around here," he said. "Even if you go away from it for a while, you come back. Work is too hard, school is too hard. But there is always a place for you in the neighborhood. Always drugs to do." While no one is immune to the problem, Tanner, who was recently laid off from a cable TV company, said Perry Homes residents are extremely wary of discussing the ubiquity of the drug with outsiders or police, who they feel lack street savvy at best, or are unreliable at worst. "The police just aren't smart enough to catch these guys," Tanner said. "Just because you have on a blue uniform and a badge doesn't mean they are perfect." The Miami Boys attempted to take over the Perry Homes, but were unsuccessful. Local dealers stood their ground and maintained control of the project. In 1993, the Crips used graffiti near the Perry Homes, claiming the area as their territory. A spray-painted signature, which tags the area as Crips turf, adorns the wall of the Thrifttown supermarket near Perry Homes. Passers-by along Perry Boulevard can't help but notice "Slob," a slur for the Bloods gang, in blue letters crossed out in blue paint, and signed by the West Side Crips. Translation: Bloods beware. This is Crips country. Graffiti, like that found on Thrifttown, has increased exponentially, as street gangs from the well-known vice lords and folks to the lesser-known local offshoots, such as the 12-Gauge Posse, have begun to attract a following. Some of the graffiti has migrated from West Coast gangs, such as 187, or Pyru, but East Coast gangs, such as the Vice Lords, seem to have a stronger hold on Atlanta, based on the graffiti styles commonly found here. A 1994 article explains that the Kool-Aid Gang was based in the Perry Homes public housing development. Members robbed the A&P Food Market at Peachtree Battle Shopping Center and were chased by police. A shootout between the gang and law enforcement led to the death of one suspect and another was wounded. This was not investigators' first encounter with the Kool-Aid Gang. Police also are investigating a link between the gang and the burglary of an East Point gun store and a carjacking in the Perry Homes area. In the 1990s, the Diablo's gang ruled the drug trade at the Perry Homes. The crew was led by Billy Diablo and David Freeman, a one-time police officer of the year. Freeman, who grew up in the Perry Homes, was named in a 2003 indictment as a key lieutenant of the Diablos. Everybody at the Perry Homes called him Day Day. He played a special role in the Diablos' enterprise, letting them know when a police investigation into them was launched. Freeman would identify drug dealers that the Diablos could shake down, and he would hand over to the gang drugs which he had taken from persons he had detained in his official capacity as a police officer. In 1999, Perry Homes was demolished and replaced with the West Highlands development, a mixed-income community with various amenities, including a YMCA.
Number 9. University Homes. University Homes was completed in 1938 and contained 675 units. It was the first federally funded public housing project for African Americans in the United States, and cost $2,500,000 to construct. It was seen as the black counterpart to the Techwood Homes, and was located between Fair Street and Northside Drive in Zone 1. The development replaced Beaver's Slide, an African American slum area near Atlanta University. Civil rights attorney Vernon Jordan grew up in the University Homes. In the 1980s, the Miami Boys were responsible for most of the drugs that were sold at the project. The gang took over vacant apartments and used them to store and distribute crack cocaine. The Miami Boys was broken up into sets, and the University Homes set sold coke on Greens Ferry Avenue and Delmar Lane. In a 1988 article, a University Homes maintenance worker explains that he has walked in on drug users several times. They pull the boards off of windows to get in, and they'd be in there, shooting it up or smoking it, he said. Along with drugs, poor maintenance was a major issue at the project. At one point, the housing authority suspended all 34 employees at the complex, from the area manager to the maintenance workers. We were getting so many complaints, I decided I would go down there and have a meeting, a supervisor explained. So one Saturday morning, I met with the tenants and said, "Show me." By Monday, everybody on that site was suspended. The allegations included lack of heat and hot water, rampant vacancy rates, bad maintenance, and flourishing drug traffic. In 1994, 2 people died and 3 were wounded in 3 separate shootings at the project. The violence began around 3 p.m. at 270 Fair Street in the University Homes housing development, when a young man was shot in the head. Witnesses said the victim, who died at the scene, was beat up by 2 males, one of whom was armed with a pistol. The suspect fired several shots, but police have no motive for the shooting or description of the suspects. Only yards away, at 6:45 p.m., 3 young men were shot in a turf dispute after they attempted to cross the street at Lawshie and Fair Streets. The victims were walking to a talent show in the area when a fight broke out with 2 men who tried to stop them from crossing the street. 4 shots were fired. 1 shot missed. One of the victims was shot in the left shoulder, another was hit in the hip, and the third person was shot in the back of the right knee, but none was seriously injured. One of the shooting victims was a Clark Atlanta University student. In 2006, University Homes residents were relocated, and in 2009, the project was demolished. In 2023, the Housing Authority announced that a mixed-income community called Ashley Scholars Landing will be built on the former grounds of the University Homes.
Zone 3, Number 10. Capitol Homes. The Capitol Homes, aka the CAP, was completed in 1942 and contained 815 units. It was located on Memorial Drive in Zone 3 and cost $2,800,000 to construct. The project was originally built for white tenants only, but by 1969, blacks were the majority at the Capitol Homes. Former NBA player Javaris Crittenton grew up in the Capitol Homes. In 2009, Crittenton and Washington Wizards teammate Gilbert Arenas were involved in a locker room confrontation, threatening each other with guns. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassin, James Earl Ray, shot and killed King in April of 1968 in Memphis, and then fled to Atlanta in his white Ford Mustang, driving 11 hours. He drove to the Capitol Homes, where he abandoned the Mustang in the parking lot and took a bus out of town. Crime was a fact of life at the Capitol Homes. "They fight over here all the time. That's all they know. Fighting and hurting each other," said Sandra Arnold, a 27-year-old resident of the Capitol Homes housing project in the dark shadow of the state capitol. The police, some of them act okay and some of them don't. Some of the big husky ones act real tough. They be handling people rough and talking bad to them. Ms. Arnold said she would like to move, but can't because she doesn't want to move from one government project to another. She is a third-generation public housing dweller. Her mother lives right behind her in another building of the Capitol Homes project, and her grandmother lives in Martin Luther King Village, a series of high-rise, low-income apartments adjacent to Capitol Homes. Crime, Ms. Arnold said, is a fact of life in the housing projects, and crime usually brings policemen, many of whom are insensitive to the plight of the black poor, according to residents. Police consider working in low-income black areas of Atlanta to be the toughest assignment in the Bureau. But beyond that, it is the underlying belief by residents of these neighborhoods that police do not care and concentrate on protecting the affluent, leaving the poor to fend for themselves. A 1996 article explains that a woman on her porch looked across Memorial Drive and saw three women at the intersection of Memorial and Connolly Street. The women stood by a payphone next to a no trespassing, no loitering sign. The sign warns folks it is a crime to hang out at Capitol Homes. The three women waved to every car passing down Memorial. An Ohio Cadillac made a U-turn and came back to park on Connolly. I had to go in the house right then, said Tina Fellis, the woman on her porch. That's when I heard the shots. Like, pop 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 pop. I looked out and saw the car again. This time, the Cadillac went backward. It came weaving backward out of Connolly and into Memorial. It went in reverse 100 yards before changing directions. It again went past the three women and past the shooters. Everyone running for darkness now. Where does the car go now? Where do you go in a strange town, after midnight, when you've been robbed at gunpoint by men who shoot to kill? You came to town for the fun of it, and you were a half-mile from the state capitol. You were a mile from the downtown police headquarters. You couldn't have known the sad truth of this town. You had entered a killing field. Gunshots happen at Capitol Homes. Plenty of people get shot here, a tenant explains, but they don't die. Tuesday, a man in his Capitol Homes apartment took 3 bullets in the back and lived through it. Earlier on the night of the murder, Louis Farrakhan warned Freaknik celebrants of danger. About that, he was right. Police say the Cadillac from Ohio stopped by the pay phone at Connolly and Memorial. They first suspected the 3 women to be part of the robbery setup, but now law enforcement says, we interrogated them. If they're involved, they're great liars. More likely, it was a coincidence of timing. The predators saw their opportunity to pull a robbery. The doves had flown into the trap. 3 men, 2 with handguns, demanded money. After handing over the money, the driver thought to escape. A shooter on the passenger side opened fire. Maybe 2 bullets struck the young man whose mother had asked him to stay away from that crazy place, Atlanta. His name was Donnie Cantrell. He was young and strong, 24. Akron to Atlanta, maybe 12 hours of good ride-in. Memorial Drive to Moreland Avenue, 1 minute. It's just under a mile from the killing intersection to an Exxon service station at Moreland Avenue. If you're in a strange town after midnight and your buddy in the back seat has been shot, you just start driving until you're the hell out of there. You pass Daddy D's barbecue joint, 2 or 3 churches, a plumber's, and the old and crumbling brick wall by Oakland Cemetery. The first light you see in the night's darkness, you stop to call the police. At the Exxon station, Donnie Cantrell tried to get out of the car and couldn't. Police and EMS personnel answered the 911 call about 1 a.m. Friday, only to find Cantrell dead in the back seat. 4 days after the shooting, Tina Fellis and Pamela Wayfield sat on a porch along Memorial Drive. They said they've had it with Freaknik. Too much traffic. Can't even get off I-20 to get home. Now this. And it's not the out-of-town folks who caused the trouble, it's our own. Our own folks don't know how to act, Wayfield said. What are you going to tell that boy's mama? Fellis said. Come all this way from Ohio to get killed. Because Capitol Homes residents identified the predators, Atlanta homicide detectives have arrested 2 men for the killing of Donnie Cantrell. The third is running. Someone should drop a dime. Capitol Homes was demolished in 2003 and redeveloped as Capitol Gateway, a mixed-income community.
Number 11. Carver Homes. Carver Homes, also known as Carver Community, was completed in 1953 and contained 990 units. It was located in southeast Atlanta on Meldon Avenue in Zone 3 near Joyland, an amusement park for Black Atlantans. The project was originally intended for African Americans only and cost $8,600,000 to build. In 1987, Carver Homes made headlines after the death of Eddie Lee Callahan, a black man, who was shot 6 times by police, 5 times in the back at point-blank range. Callahan was a car theft suspect. The officer claimed he shot him during a struggle for control of a gun. After the shooting, about 400 residents of the Carver Homes housing project angrily protested the scene. A 1988 article titled "Carver Homes Held Hostage and Drug Wars" explains, drive almost due south from downtown Atlanta on Pryor Street, cross the downtown connector, and begin counting the liquor stores, this area's most ubiquitous business. After about half a dozen, look left. The collection of dilapidated, red brick, graffiti-scarred buildings, sprawling in the red clay below the city skyline, is the Carver Homes housing project. Look right. The half-dozen run-down, heavily barred stores on the opposite corner of Pryor Street make up Joyland Plaza. This is a skirmishing ground in the city's struggle with cocaine. Nights are the busiest time here, but even during the day unease clings to this community, and the commerce never stops. In this place, young men, they would be boys anywhere else, 13, 14, 15 years old, run to cars and stick their hands through open windows, while old men with dead eyes lounge against the storefronts. The young men are dope dealers, the old men drunks. When a gunshot split the air here on a recent afternoon, a group of young people, playing baseball on the patchy diamond, continued their game. Residents watched impassively from front stoops as 3 teenagers, one of them carrying a rifle, wrapped in a blanket, ran up a hill from one of the enclaves where drugs are sold. A few minutes later, another shot was fired. No one called police. That response suggests the dilemma facing law enforcement in places like Carver Homes. To a degree, police say, the drug dealers have replaced the lottery men of old, establishing the same relationship with residents. People know they can borrow money from the dealers, get their rent paid by them, or get a dime bag of marijuana, or a $25 bag of crack on credit. In the old days, few people were willing to snitch on the kingpin, because he was seen as a boon to the community. Now, it's getting harder to bust dealers, police say, because more and more people won't help identify them. Limousines driven by dealers. A black limousine drives past on Joyland Street, followed shortly by a white one. Those are the drug dealers renting those, tenant, Ms. Dixon says. They park them all the time in Carver Homes. Now how can anybody living in Carver afford to ride in a limousine? If ain't nobody dead, you ain't got no business over in this area with no limousine. Come to Carver Homes at mid-afternoon, on most any weekday, and you'll find a great many young black males, lounging on porches, shooting baskets at the netless hoop near the center of the project, sipping from brown paper bags in cars with radios blaring. Ms. Dixon believes that about half the people she knew in Carver Homes are either using drugs or selling drugs. Carver Homes was demolished in 1998. The Villages at Carver, a mixed-income community, was built on the former site of the project.
Number 12. Englewood Manor. Englewood Manor was completed in 1971 and contained 324 units. It was located on Galt Street in Zone 3, about 10 blocks from the federal penitentiary. Grocery stores were about 2 miles south, with a smaller grocer located on the outskirts of the pen. Residents would eagerly await the daily arrival of Pop's Store, an old rusted school bus that doubled as a convenience store. In the 80s, Englewood Manor became notorious for drugs and violence. The Englewood Clique, aka EWC, was an active gang in the project. A 1988 article explains, "I hear shooting all the time in broad daylight," said a resident of Englewood Manor housing project in southeast Atlanta Zone 3, which has seen some of the most violent results of the cocaine street trade. "It's very frightening day and night. I have to walk right through that to get to the community center. And you don't ever know when the little kids are going to go through a shooting match. I know about some of these kids," the Englewood resident said. "Their parents are hooked on crack too, and have abandoned them. They just move off and leave their kids. Then you'll see these same kids show up, driving around here with a new car." Most dealers had lookouts, making it difficult for law enforcement to identify them. An officer explains, in Englewood Manor housing project, children ran between an old school bus parked in a driveway and a line of late-model cars driving slowly through. Transactions visibly were being carried out through car windows. Once lookouts realized their retail business was being monitored, the street market evaporated. There were cars pulled up into the yard, close to the buildings. Residents are afraid to park in the parking lots. The walk is too dangerous. In 1989, 2 Atlanta men were convicted of murdering an innocent 15-year-old. In July, after a dispute with a purported drug dealer at Englewood Manor, the pair, who were given a prison life sentence, had apparently exchanged gunfire with the drug dealer, left the scene and returned with weapons, and waited for him. But instead, they shot Corey Willis, a 10th grader, who happened to pass by the scene. In 2007, Englewood Manor tenants were relocated due to severe physical and social distress, leading to the property's demolition in 2009. In 2024, Atlanta Housing celebrated the groundbreaking of Englewood Senior and Independent Senior Living Project, which marks the first redevelopment phase of a master-planned, mixed-use community on the 30-acre site of the former Englewood Manor project.
Number 13. Gilbert Gardens. Gilbert Gardens, aka Pool Creek, was completed in 1971 and contained 650 units. The project was located at East Lake Boulevard and Gilbert Road in Zone 3. A 1981 article explains that Rev. Tim Hobbs's Travelers Rest Baptist Church is located across the street from Gilbert Gardens, an Atlanta Housing Authority project which police describe as a dangerous place to live and patrol. Hobbs's church has been burglarized on several occasions. Zone 3 is called the war zone by policemen because there is a housing project on nearly every beat. An officer explains that he doesn't understand why some of the people around here have such a negative attitude about law enforcement. They might hate the police today, he said, but they'll like them tomorrow, because they'll need us. Still, many poor residents are finding it hard to trust the police. You really can't trust them too much, a 33-year-old resident of the Gilbert Gardens housing project on Gilbert Road in southeast Atlanta said recently. I feel they should work a little harder, a 12-year-old who lives in the project said. I see fights every day, man. And officers take their time getting there. Most of them, they scared to come in here too. Gilbert Gardens is located in the war zone. In 1988, Jackie Weeks, president of the Tenants Association at Gilbert Gardens, explained that a lot of people get confused. They think it's grown people, but in my community we have a gang of 12, 13 and 14-year-olds. An 11-year-old is the head of it. They're stealing cars and have Uzi machine guns. In 1995, 3 people were charged with gunning down an East Point man in an alleged robbery attempt as he was walking through Gilbert Gardens. DeJuan Freeman died after he was shot in the chest at the complex, in the 400 block of Flynn Road. Witnesses told police the suspects drove off in a red Mustang convertible. Police spotted a car matching the description about 2 hours later on Lucky Street, and arrested Carl Norman on murder and armed robbery charges. A 1997 article explains that the Atlanta Housing Authority is embarking on an ambitious plan to fence and install guard gates at many of its properties over the next several years. Striving for safety, gates are expected to go up to help fight crime at Gilbert Gardens apartments, where residential IDs are issued. Walter Murphy, a childhood friend of Young Thug and co-founder of YSL, grew up in the Gilbert Gardens housing project. He was one of the prosecution's star witnesses in the RICO case against Thug. Murphy, known as DK, spent 7 years in prison for being one of the gunmen in the 2015 gas station shooting. He was also indicted in the RICO case in 2022 but released after 7 months in jail after pleading guilty and admitting that YSL was a gang. Murphy's attorney Jacoby Hudson said that when his client was younger, he robbed people to give Young Thug food. That's how poor they grew up. It was dirt poverty. Gilbert Gardens was demolished in 2004. A new development could not be built on the site because of the expansion of the Atlanta airport.
Number 14. Jonesboro North. Jonesboro North was completed in 1972 and contained 100 units. The project was located on Jonesboro Road in Zone 3. A 1988 article explains that a shooting occurred at the Jonesboro North public housing complex as Atlanta police were assisting DeKalb police, serving warrants on Joland Hayes and Victor Cooper. The DeKalb County homicide detective who fired has been suspended with pay until investigations by Atlanta and DeKalb police are finished. The detective told investigators that he shot Hayes after Hayes ignored an order to halt and made a sudden move toward a bulge in his waistband that was later determined to be a sock. No weapon was found at the scene. In the early 90s, a gang called the North Boys terrorized the project. A 1995 article explains that 10 people whom Atlanta police suspect are members of the North Boys gang were arrested Friday in a dragnet that netted $4,000, drugs, and 3 guns, 2 of which were stashed in a children's bedroom. The North Boys gang originated in the Jonesboro North housing project in southeast Atlanta and consists mostly of juveniles who grew up there, police said. The bust was the result of a 2-month investigation by the Task Force, Red Dogs, and Weed and Seed Police, Special Drug Squads of Atlanta Police, and GBI agents. According to law enforcement officials, gang members band together to sell drugs, and they stand on the street and harass people coming into the housing projects. Residents of the projects complain that they can't even have visitors. In 2007, Atlanta police charged 17-year-old Frederick Dion Jones with the slaying of 1 man and the shooting of 3 others. after an argument disintegrated into violence. Shortly after noon on a Friday, witnesses said Jones began arguing with the men in the parking lot of the Jonesboro North apartments at 2291 Jonesboro Road, then left, went to an apartment, returned with a handgun and opened fire. 2 victims, including the dead man, underwent surgery at Grady Memorial Hospital, police said. The others suffered non-threatening injuries. Jonesboro North was demolished in 2008.
Number 15. Jonesboro South. Jonesboro South was completed in 1970 and contained 160 units. It was located in Zone 3. A 1975 article explains that getting children to a doctor to be immunized against childhood diseases is no easy task in the best of times. For residents of the Jonesboro South public housing project, it verges on the impossible. Although the project is only a few miles down Jonesboro Road from Lakewood Health Center, buses run infrequently and are unreliable. In 1994, police discovered that an HIV-positive drug dealer, who openly threatened to kill several officers during his trial, was accidentally released from Fulton County Jail. Widespread fear was reported in the Jonesboro South housing project, where Keith Lamar Allison has allegedly terrorized residents for years. "Everybody out here knows him, and they know he's just mean," said a Jonesboro South resident. "We heard he'd gotten life, and we figured we wouldn't see him for a while. He was back in 2 days. How do they make mistakes like that?" A 1995 article explains that a second youth was arrested and charged with murder in connection with the slaying of an 18-year-old Fayetteville resident at a Jonesboro Road housing complex. The 15-year-old's mother turned him into police. A 16-year-old youth accompanied by his parents surrendered to authorities and also was charged with murder. Both suspects lived in the Jonesboro South public housing complex. The 16-year-old allegedly shot George Dahlman II in the head as he sat in the back seat of a car with 3 other young men. Young Thug grew up in the complex. His album Business is Business features the track Jonesboro. On the song, he raps about his journey from the project to becoming one of the most popular artists in the world. Thug calls the development Little Haiti due to the high crime rate and constant violence. The complex was located on Jonesboro Road, which intersects with Cleveland Avenue, or if you're Blood, Cleveland, since Bloods prefer B's over C's. According to the feds, Thug was a part of the ROC gang, also known as Raised on Cleveland, which eventually became YSL, aka Young Slime Life. On the second day of trial, Young Thug's attorney, Brian Steele, refuted the state's allegations that the Grammy-winning rapper, whose real name is Jeffrey Williams, is also the co-founder and shot caller of a violent criminal gang. Growing up as the 10th of 11 children in the Jonesboro South projects, Williams and his siblings rarely had enough to eat, Steele said. Williams shared a bedroom with 4 brothers while his 6 sisters shared another room. Violence was part of daily life. He said his clients' friends and relatives were regularly harassed by the police, and Williams was only 9 when he saw his older brother die of a gunshot wound. Jeffrey Williams was born into an environment, a community, a society filled with repression, despair, hopelessness, and helplessness. He also said his client grew up idolizing rappers Tupac Shakur and Lil Wayne, and he believed he could break the generational hopelessness he was born into by becoming either a professional athlete or musical artist. He portrayed Williams as a shy, hard-working musician who always remembered who his friends were and where he came from. Steele also walked the jurors through several sets of lyrics the state plans to use as evidence in the case, arguing many of the verses were misconstrued or taken out of context. He speaks about killing 12 and people being shot, and drugs and drive-by shootings. This is the environment that he grew up in. These are the people he knew. These are stories he knew, Steele said. These are the words that he rhymed. In 2007, Jonesboro South residents were relocated and the project was demolished in 2008.
Number 16. Martin Street Plaza. Martin Street Plaza, better known as the Summerhill Projects, was completed in 1979 and contains 60 units of low-rise, multi-family housing. Unlike most of the complexes on this list, it has not been demolished. The project is located in Zone 3 at the corner of Martin Street and Georgia Avenue in the Model Cities neighborhood. Summerhill is controlled by Bloods, and the development was a war zone in the 1980s due to the crack epidemic, which led to gang violence. Rapper YFN Lucci grew up in the area, and his 2018 debut album was titled Ray Ray from Summerhill. According to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, police reported 43 crimes at the project from 2017 through 2022, including 14 aggravated assaults and 2 robberies. Hattie Harrison, president of the Martin Street Plaza Resident Association, started patrolling the complex with a bat. She recruited teenage boys to do the same. "We kept the drugs out of here long as we could with the bats," said Harrison. "We never did have the right kind of police protection in here. We were just a bunch of people put up here to fend for ourselves." Harrison disbanded the Bat Boys after an officer told her she would be arrested if they ever hurt someone. A 1991 article explains that in Harrison's dream, there are no drugs, no dealers, no bullets, and no dead children in the Martin Street Plaza housing project. But as the Olympics spotlight the blighted neighborhood around Martin Street, just east of the Olympic Stadium site, Ms. Harrison and other housing project tenants continue to wake up to the difficulties of trying to fulfill the dream of owning their homes and managing their community. "Right now, we can't do nothing but dodge bullets and pray the Lord will save us," said Harrison, whose bedroom mirror was shattered in the hail of bullets that killed 11-year-old Jeremiah Anderson. The development has become a drop-off point for drug gangs, who make a quick getaway down Georgia Avenue or through a thick kudzu valley in back of the project. Police say the well-traveled street makes it easy to sell crack and cocaine to drive-by customers. Discouragement and a sense of isolation also plague Martin Street residents, who say the small size of the neighborhood makes it a forgotten island in the sea of large public housing projects. Tenants listed their problems in a letter to 37 local, city, state, and national leaders. "Martin Street Plaza is drowning in a sea of drugs," the letter said. In July of 2022, Atlanta announced that the complex was on a list of properties to be targeted because of chronic crime and condition problems. In recent years, gentrification has transformed Summerhill at a rapid pace. Many longtime residents can no longer afford to live in the area.
Number 17. McDaniel-Glenn. The McDaniel-Glenn project was completed in 1968 and contained 307 units. It was located in South Atlanta's Mechanicsville neighborhood on McDaniel Street in Zone 3. The development was initially a great place to call home, but by the late 70s, it was infested with rats and horribly maintained. A 1978 article explains, at around 9 p.m., you begin noticing the rats at the McDaniel-Glenn housing project in southwest Atlanta. On an early autumn night spent in the projects, you discover that an overabundance of rats is only one reason McDaniel-Glenn residents believe that their living conditions are inhuman. More rats than you ever want to see again. An apparent apartment burglary in progress. A tough-looking Vietnam veteran who confesses that he doesn't think he is capable of defending himself at the complex. Generalizations about life in so many projects are obviously difficult to make, but indisputably, there are AHA developments where many residents lead productive lives, proving stereotypes about public housing wrong. And there are other projects, like McDaniel-Glenn, where life, as one tenant describes it, is often nothing but agony. For many McDaniel-Glenn residents, the days are merely depressing. The nights are rife with terror and the disheartening realization that nothing is going to change. Before inspecting a vacant second-floor apartment in the McDaniel-Glenn housing project on an afternoon in the late 80s, AHA Deputy Director Betty Davis stopped and sent a male employee up to make sure it was not full of drug dealers. There were none that day, but her request illustrated the problem. The housing authority is in charge of the projects, but that does not mean they are under AHA control. Housing authority officials say they are working to change that, but they also say that infestation of drug peddlers in public housing is so pervasive that any unit left vacant, for more than a few days, is likely to become an instant crack house, where anyone with $10 can buy the potent cocaine derivative. What Ms. Davis found in McDaniel-Glenn Unit 1539, one of 59 vacancies at the 496-unit complex, was the toilet sitting in the living room, the downstairs knee-deep in broken furniture and garbage, the windows ripped out of the walls, and the front door torn off its hinges and lying on the landing. A 1988 article explains that Southside High School football star Gary Camatrice Williams, 17, was shot to death in October on a street in the McDaniel-Glenn housing project. Police found a revolver and 2 packets of white powder under his body. Police said he may have been killed for trying to sell baking soda as cocaine. Richard Woodall, 19, was found shot to death earlier this month on Whitehall Terrace, outside a McDaniel-Glenn building. Police said he was known as a petty dealer of cocaine. Tenants said there was gunfire several times the night before Woodall's body was found early on a Friday morning. Experienced dealers make it difficult for law enforcement to keep tabs on their operations at the complex. In the McDaniel-Glenn housing project, where there have been at least 3 drug-related killings in recent months, the business is conducted on street corners and in courtyards. Every block or so, a lookout is posted. These transactions look casual, but are in fact highly organized. One guy will hold the money, one will hold the dope, and sometimes, there will be 2 or 3 guys around with guns. The dealers do it that way to stay out of jail. Possession of drugs alone is a less serious charge than possession of guns and drugs. If one man isn't holding money and drugs, it's difficult to charge him with trafficking. Unless a man is charged with trafficking, he can usually get out on bond fairly quickly. The dealers know this. A 1995 article explains that 8-year-old Kimberly Session and 2 friends were playing near their homes in the McDaniel-Glenn housing complex on May 17, 1994, when they were caught in crossfire among 5 men involved in an argument over a woman. Stray gunfire struck Kimberly in the face. 2 other children, Gregory Lindsay, 7, and Kimberly's cousin, Tequil Session, 9, were hit in the arm and thigh, but were less seriously wounded. Kim's sister, Katisha Walden, 10, said, "We can't even play. We can't even be safe." Kimberly still carries a pea-sized scar on her left cheek from a buckshot pellet, but the deeper wounds to her psyche seem to have healed. That gunfire in May of 1994 galvanized Mayor Bill Campbell, who vowed to hear Kimberly sing in church one day. He made another promise to the child's neighbors at the McDaniel-Glenn housing project. Before summer was over, they would have their own police precinct and patrols. 15 months later, Campbell visited St. Mark Baptist Church, as Kimberly led the youth choir in a rousing gospel anthem. He took credit for reopening McDaniel-Glenn's community center, shuttered by the city 4 years earlier. But the precinct never opened, and a foot patrol disappeared after 5 months. "Crime became badder than ever," said tenant leader Sandra Gates. "Police should have been there when Kimberly was shot." The Atlanta Housing Authority had contracted for 24-hour patrols in McDaniel-Glenn and 19 other projects, but police never fulfilled the agreement. According to the Housing Authority's 2005 annual report, McDaniel-Glenn had the highest crime rate of any AHA property, and the nearby elementary school, Dunbar, was the worst-performing elementary school in the city of Atlanta. Rapper Young Jeezy was often seen at McDaniel-Glenn back in the day, in his baby blue box Chevy. Jeezy's former group, Boys in the Hood, filmed the video for their song Them Boys at the McDaniel-Glenn complex, and one of the group's members, Big G, grew up in the area. The project was demolished in 2006, and in 2007 construction was completed and the development was renamed Columbia Residential at Mechanicsville Station.
Number 18. Thomasville Heights. Thomasville Heights was completed in 1970 and contained 350 units. The project was located on Henry Thomas Drive in Zone 3. The Crips dominated the complex, including Forest Cove, which was a large Section 8 housing development in the Thomasville Heights community. Rapper Young L.A. grew up in the project. He's best known for his debut single, Ain't I, which peaked at number 7 on Billboard's Hot Hip Hop Songs chart. In the late 70s, multiple Thomasville Heights residents were victims of the Atlanta child murders. Tenants say Wayne Williams, who was convicted for the homicides, recruited kids at the project, claiming that he could work with them to develop their talent so they could get record deals. A 1982 article explains, in the rows of public housing units in the Thomasville Heights projects, on the city's southeast side, it is no surprise that many people say they were tuned into their radios and televisions Saturday to hear the verdict in the case against Wayne B. Williams. They had reason for especially sharp interest in who was found responsible for the deaths and disappearances of 29 young blacks. 3 of the slain youngsters had lived in the housing project. Snitching could be dangerous when you live in a neighborhood like Thomasville Heights, especially during the crack epidemic. In the late 80s, 2 Molotov cocktails were tossed into an apartment at the complex, sending 2 small children to the hospital. The tenant was allegedly giving the police information about drug dealers in the community. On Christmas Day in the late 1980s, Timothy Harris and a friend of his, accompanied by a resident of the area, were cruising for drugs in the Thomasville Heights housing project in the wee hours. When the men were suspected by the dealers of being undercover officers, they drove off. Shots were fired, and Mr. Harris was struck. This was not an isolated incident. An Atlanta police officer said Mr. Harris was the 4th suburbanite slain in the Thomasville area in the last 2 years. A 1991 article explains that Atlanta police are searching for suspects in 2 shootings that left 2 men dead and 1 wounded. Witnesses told officers that Dexter Hood was arguing with another man over drugs outside 380 Thomasville Boulevard in the Thomasville Heights projects. When they heard shots, Mr. Hood was shot several times in the face, and witnesses saw at least 3 men jump into a blue pickup and speed away. In December of 1991, Atlanta police officer Niles Johansson was shot in the back of the head in the Thomasville Heights housing project he patrolled. The officer was known by his nickname, Russian, in the neighborhood. In 1993, a man named Norris Speed was convicted and sentenced to die for the murder of the officer. But in 2010, A court ordered that Speed be resentenced because a bailiff had read to the jury Bible verses that condoned the death penalty. The bailiff also prayed with jurors, and even asked them for contributions to his ministry. In 2017, an appeals court threw out Speed's death sentence, and prosecutors agreed not to seek a new death sentence if he would accept life without parole, which he agreed to. Thomasville Heights was demolished in 2010, and residents were displaced. When numerous tenants couldn't find alternative housing using their Section 8 vouchers, they moved to Forest Cove, aka Villa Monte, aka the Four Seasons Projects. Forest Cove was a privately owned, publicly subsidized development across the street from the Thomasville Heights projects. Although it's not a public housing project, it was located in the Thomasville Heights community, and was one of the most notorious developments in Atlanta. The complex was completed in 1971, and contained 404 units. The development was built on 100 acres of former prison land, donated by the federal government. The name wasn't Forest Cove when the complex initially opened. The sign outside the townhomes said Seasons 4, but everyone called it Four Seasons. During this same period, legal documents called the complex the Villa Monte Homes. It started as a housing cooperative for families of mixed incomes. Their rent went toward the mortgage, which HUD subsidized. Hawaisha Briley, who joined her mom at the project as a kid, says the community saw itself as different from public housing, like the Thomasville Heights project across the street. The development was isolated. It was located between long stretches of forest and the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where rapper T.I. was locked up after trying to buy unregistered guns from undercover agents. The complex was split into two sides that went by different nicknames. The side next to the penitentiary was known as Glock Block, and the side by the elementary school was known as the Horseshoe. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution explains that Forest Cove has been notorious for crimes, including multiple homicides. The project at one point had the lowest HUD inspection score of any multi-family housing complex in the nation. A premises liability lawsuit filed by one tenant alleged that a mother and her child both fell through a floor and suffered injuries. Repeated fires at the development include those in 2017 and 2019. In 2014, an elite FBI team rescued Frank Arthur Jansen from the Forest Cove apartments after he was kidnapped from his home in North Carolina. Jansen's daughter prosecuted a reputed gang member who allegedly orchestrated the abduction from his maximum security prison cell. 1/8 Trey Blood member, Kelvin Melton, aka Dizzy, or Old Man, used a cell phone that he illegally possessed while serving a life sentence in North Carolina's Polk Correction Institution to transmit instructions to co-conspirators in the plot, who then sent threats to Jansen's wife. Forest Cove's 1000 block was the most dangerous. In 2015, the Atlanta Constitution reported that a man, nicknamed Graveyard, was shot and killed on the 1000 block of Newtown Circle Southeast. He was transported to Grady Memorial Hospital, where he died of his injuries. Residents told police the shooters got away on foot. Forest Cove was demolished in March of 2024. Former residents that were displaced say that they've been relocated to the outskirts, some as far as Stockbridge and Ellenwood. The mayor promised to build a new affordable housing complex in Thomasville Heights, and says he'll do everything in his legal authority to ensure that all Forest Cove residents that wish to return to Thomasville Heights will have a pathway to do so.
Zone 4, Number 19. Kimberly Courts. Kimberly Courts, also known as Kimberly Road, was completed in 1973 and contained 300 units. The complex was located in southwest Atlanta, off Cascade Road in Zone 4. Creative Loafing explains that young Dro, who's originally from Bankhead, grew up singing in the choir at Smith Chapel Baptist Church, but things went downhill after his family moved from Bankhead and subsequently bounced around Atlanta, living in poor neighborhoods like Kimberly Courts. These are raw spots, he said of the apartment building where his family lived. When young Dro was a teenager, he hustled on the streets and got shot at 16. The Miami boys took over the Kimberly Courts during the 80s and 90s. Local dealers didn't have enough firepower to run them away, but the gang had to put their lives and freedom on the line to maintain control of the complex. 2 Miami boys were convicted of shooting up the Kimberly Courts apartments in August 1993, killing 1 teen and leaving 5 other people injured. Wade Russell, 25, and Derek Roberts, also 25, were part of 3 carloads of people who opened fire the night of August 10th, with numerous guns, including at least 3 AK-47s. The shooting was part of an effort by the notorious gang to take over drug sales in the area. Russell and Roberts were convicted of murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a weapon by a convicted felon. The judge sentenced them both to life plus 140 years in prison. In 1995, federal agents, including an agent whose life had been threatened, arrested 10 suspected members of the Miami Boys. All 10 were charged with conspiracy to distribute cocaine in Kimberly Courts and other public housing projects. In the mid-90s, the bodies of 2 dancers were found shot to death in the trunk of a car, less than a mile from Kimberly Courts. They were tortured, their bodies were burned and cut, and their fingers were broken. Tammy Lindley and Tasha McDowell both worked at Little Nicky on Stewart Avenue. A passerby found the bullet-riddled bodies in the open trunk of a late-model white Mitsubishi Mirage near Kimberly Road's intersection with Melvin Drive. A 1996 article explains that even in many dangerous neighborhoods, violence is concentrated in public housing, according to the computer analysis. At half of the AHA's low-rise projects, the violent crime rate was at least 60% higher than in the immediate neighborhood. The most extreme example was the Kimberly Courts complex off Cascade Road, where violent crime was more than 5 times as likely as elsewhere in the neighborhood. The project was demolished in 1998. Ashley Courts at Cascade, the redevelopment of Kimberly Courts, opened as a mixed-income community in 2001.
Zone 5. Number 20. Grady Homes. Grady Homes was completed in 1942 and contained 495 units. The project was built for black tenants only and cost $3,100,000 to construct. The development was located on Bell Street in the Sweet, Auburn neighborhood of Zone 5. During the crack epidemic, the Miami Boys dominated the complex. A 1988 Orlando Sentinel article explains that at the Grady Homes development, community activist Susie Labord says elderly residents were being terrorized by drug-related crimes such as robberies, purse snatchings and break-ins. Police say the crew more closely resemble an organized crime family than a youth gang. Although members have been found operating out of privately owned apartments in Atlanta, their primary concentration was in the projects. The Miami Boys moved into Atlanta's low-income neighborhoods in 1986 because they provided an untapped market for organized drug dealing. Before the gang's arrival, the drug trade largely was small-time and run by independent dealers. Gang members also took advantage of the size of Atlanta's housing projects, where they can disappear into doorways and commandeer any of the city's 1,300 vacant units for their drug activities. In the projects, the gang also found a ready-made clientele willing to pay top dollar for high-quality cocaine. An ounce of cocaine that brings $500 in Miami sells for $1,400 to $1,800 in Atlanta. A resident wrote the following prayer: God, please help us to move out of Grady Homes. Let us move into a house, and I hope it will be soon. Lord, please bless me and my family. Our prayers are for you to help us. I love you, Heavenly Father, and Mama, I love you too. 1 week after writing this prayer, 13-year-old Aisha Hurd was killed, shot in the head, while she was being used as a human shield in a gunfight between 2 feuding 18-year-olds. In 1993, David Matthew Harold went into Brian Hendricks's store on the corner of Church and Commerce Street, put a bag of chips on the counter, then pulled out a .22 handgun and shot Hendricks above the left eye. From the age of 12, Harold began to be treated at a series of psychiatric institutions. Traveling around the metro area on MARTA, he became involved with a gang from the Grady Homes. Adopted by the crew as their sole white member, the 6'3" youth was given the street name of Hitman and had the word tattooed on his left arm. Shortly before he shot Hendricks, he had run away from Hillside Academy, a residential facility in southwest Atlanta, and rejoined the gang at Grady Homes. The Grady Homes project was demolished in 2005, and in 2013, it was replaced by the Ashley Auburn Point Complex, a mixed-income community.
Number 21. Techwood Homes. In 1936, Techwood Homes became the first public housing project built in America. The complex contained 571 units and cost $2,375,000 to construct. It was located northwest of downtown, between the Coca-Cola headquarters and Georgia Tech's campus in Zone 5, and was originally built for white occupants only. The average salary of the first Techwood Homes residents was $21.81 a week. They paid $5.52 a month in rent. S. Truett Cathy and Cecil Day grew up in Techwood in the 1930s. Cathy is the founder of Chick-fil-A and Day is the founder of the Days Inn hotel chain. Decades later, Alpha Mega, a rapper previously signed to T.I.'s Grand Hustle Records, lived in Techwood. The project is featured in the Stars BMF series. Techwood replaced a low-income neighborhood known as Tan Yard Bottom aka Tech Flats. About 30% of Tanyard Bottom was African American, and since Techwood was intended for whites only, blacks were given vouchers and displaced. After the civil rights movement, integration changed Techwood. By the 1970s, the complex was 50% black. As whites fled and the crack epidemic overwhelmed the city, crime and violence increased rapidly at the project. Pine Street was one of Techwood's most dangerous strips. It was one of the few places in the city where you could get away with murder in broad daylight. Some of the gangs active at Techwood include the Young Posse, aka YP, and of course the Miami Boys, who dominated the drug trade at the complex. To introduce themselves to local drug dealers in Atlanta, the Miami Boys kidnapped a 22-year-old pusher from the Techwood Homes, shot him in the head several times, and dumped his body in another county. In 1988, Winston Theodore Brown, one of the leaders of the Miami Boys, was convicted in the Techwood Homes murder of a gang member. Dealers made thousands of dollars in profits, with minimal effort in Techwood. It was the only project in downtown Atlanta, located in the middle of the city. All traffic had to come through the project, making it prime real estate for gangs to sell their drugs. In 1994, Techwood residents were given vouchers to relocate, to make way for development related to the 1996 Olympics. The project was demolished and replaced by Centennial Place, a mixed-income community.
Number 22. Clark Howell Homes. The Clark Howell Homes was completed in 1940 and contained 630 units. The complex cost $3,500,000 to construct. It was located at the intersection of North Avenue, Lovejoy Street, Mill Street and Lucky Street, in Zone 5, and was originally built for white occupants only. Public housing complexes integrated in 1968, and as black residents moved in, whites moved out. By 1975, blacks were the majority at the Clark Howell Homes. Tenants often pray for redeveloped units, with new, modern amenities, but at Clark Howell, not even contractors were safe. A 1983 article explains that while families wait to return to their newly renovated homes in the Clark Howell housing project, contractors battle thefts and vandalism that have cost them $50,000, plus the time it takes to redo work already completed. We've been plagued with a series of problems when working there, said Al West, president of Ace Contracting Company, which is renovating Clark Howell Homes. West said the problems go beyond minor vandalism. We had a theft last Sunday where somebody stole 9 wheels and brand new tires off trailers, he said. They were worth $3,000. In another incident, burglars took $30,000 worth of electrical supplies and equipment from a warehouse near the renovation site. He said the company employs a watchman during the 8 hours a day that work is not going on at the project. Another contracting company, Winter Company Builders, avoided vandalism when renovating Oakland City by offering residents $10,000 to keep vandals away. The $10,000 check was presented to the neighborhood in June. I went a step further than that, West said. I've employed as many people who live in the project as I could to work for the company. We've hired 20 or 25 people who live there. We feel it would be in their own best interest to report thefts and vandalism. In the late 1980s, Sam and Desiree Tillis left the south side of Chicago to get away from menacing drug dealers. They were truly blessed to find a clean, seemingly safe apartment at Atlanta's Clark Howell Homes. But 8 months later, Mr. Tillis and his 18-year-old wife decided they'd rather be homeless than spend another night hiding in a closet from gun-toting drug dealers who had shot their apartment windows. The Dillies sued the Atlanta Housing Authority seeking another AHA apartment and disputing charges for back rent for the apartment they vacated after repeatedly requesting to be moved. A judge ordered the AHA to act with all possible speed to locate a decent, safe, sanitary home for the Dillies. Tenants should not be forced to sleep in closets or under their beds to avoid gunfire, said Judge Etheridge. The drug dealers, Mr. Tillis said in court papers, congregated in front of their apartment and on their front porch, and harassed him because he wouldn't buy drugs. Then they'd want to fight and want to shoot, he said in the suit. The couple asked to be moved to another complex after drug dealers twice put a gun to Mr. Tillis's face, the suit said. The couple fled the apartment after spending the night huddled in a small closet, fearing that the drug dealers, who had shot through the apartment windows, would return. Mr. Tillis thought it was better to be homeless and alive than to be a victim of the drug dealers at the development. Clark Howell was the city's most dangerous public housing project in 1995, reporting 1 violent crime for every 5 residents. Clark Howell was demolished in 1996, along with the neighboring Techwood Homes, as part of the redevelopment for the Summer Olympics. The neighborhood was renamed Centennial Place and is now a mixed-income community.
Zone 6. Number 23. East Lake Meadows. East Lake Meadows was completed in 1970 and contains 654 units. It was located on East Lake Boulevard in Zone 6. The development was one of the most infamous of all of Atlanta's public housing projects. It was immediately plagued by maintenance problems due to poor construction. Reporter Bill Selden of the Atlanta Constitution compared the number of murders at the project to Vietnam. The name stuck, and people started calling it Little Vietnam. The Miami boys weren't able to take over East Lake like they took over other projects in the city. Local dealers and gangs protected their turf and ran the Miami boys away. The Down by Law gang originated in East Lake Meadows and dominated the project. According to a 1986 article, Down by Law, Atlanta's largest, best organized, and most violent youth gang, got its start in 1981 as a small group of young teenagers who armed themselves and moved in packs for protection during the child murders in Atlanta. In early 1985, they had their first shootout with another gang, the Creepers. Members of Down by Law have been linked to robbery, assault, and other crimes. In an intimidating show of strength, gang members descended upon the Atlantis Youth Club, situated in a suburban shopping mall. A witness claims members had Uzi submachine guns. In 1986, Timothy Peanut Harris, one of the gang's leaders, who was 19 at the time, was charged with the murder of a 16-year-old, Vayshawn Jackson, who was believed to have been a member of the 5% Nation. Other gangs that were active in East Lake include Down by Law Jr. and Ladies Down by Law. Police claim that members acted as couriers for drug dealers. By 1989, the conditions at East Lake were so horrible that residents begged the governor to reach out to the National Guard to help deal with the crime. Instead, when Maynard Jackson became mayor in 1990, he assigned 200 officers to patrol the complex. The patrols ended after 2 months. Within weeks, thugs pumped more than 40 bullets into an East Lake Meadows apartment, blowing a hole in 4-year-old Monica Carr's heart as she slept. A 1991 article explains that a group of East Lake Meadows residents spent an hour warning former President Jimmy Carter how tough it would be to rid their development of the social ills his Atlanta project plan promises to tackle. A Sunday morning argument at the complex made the same point in minutes when a man was shot and stabbed during a spat over a woman. There ain't nothing here but a bunch of vacant buildings and a bunch of people thrown up there together, sleeping on top of each other like rats and roaches, Eva Davis said. Davis was president of the East Lake Tenants Association and became a pivotal figure in revitalizing the project after it was demolished in the late 1990s. She was a local activist and community leader who pioneered the reconstruction of East Lake Meadows into the Villages of East Lake, which replaced the complex. The new, mixed-income community included an education center and private golf course. Davis passed away in 2012 after a battle with ovarian cancer. In 2018, East Lake Boulevard was renamed Eva Davis Way. What did you think about this list? Which public housing project in Atlanta do you think was the worst of all time? Do you think Atlanta made a mistake when it demolished all of its public housing and replaced the complexes with mixed-income communities? Share your thoughts in the comments.